Good evening. My name is Sandra Valtero, and I'm your host tonight. This is Be Prepared, and tonight we are discussing domestic violence part 2. Last month we had a lot of information on what happens and what the meaning of the word domestic violence and some of the things that people do to get help around that subject matter. Tonight we're going to talk a lot about the laws involved and how things have changed and how the law gets involved with the communities to help in this situation. I'd like to introduce my guest tonight. First of all, to my left, District Attorney Marian T. Ryan from the Middlesex District Attorney's Office. She has been more than 3 decades of experience prosecuting the state's most violent felons, fighting for victims, and creating innovative crime prevention initiatives. District Attorney Ryan is responsible for the prosecution of approximately 35,000 cases a year in the 54 cities and towns of Middlesex counties. And Attorney Ryan is also, she has created countrywide workplace safety and violence prevention programs, and as chief of the Mayo is the MDAO's Elder and Disabled Unit, where she prosecuted crimes involving physical and financial abuse of the most vulnerable victims. As chair of the nonprofit group Middlesex Partnership for Youth Incorporated, she has led lectures and workshops on the dangers of prescriptions, drug abuse, teen dating, violence, anti-bullying, and distracting driving. Ryan created Safe Babies, Safe Kids, an initiative focused on keeping children safe, healthy, and well from birth to high school. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And next to Ms. District Attorney Ryan is Anne Marie Brown, who is a police detective here in Burlington for over 26 years. She is currently assigned to the Detective Division investigating incidents involving domestic violence, sexual assault, elder, child, and disabled persons abuse. Welcome.
Thank you.
And next to her is Jessica Teperow, who's the Director of Education and Prevention at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence. And Jessica has worked in the field of sexual assault and domestic violence prevention for the past 15 years in Boston, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco Bay Area. She has years of experience coordinating education and outreach programs and providing direct services at rape crisis centers and domestic violence organizations, including Rape Trauma Services of San Mateo County and Casa Marina in Boston. She has used her academic research on different violence prevention methods and curricula to create and implement dating and sexual violence programming with colleges, universities, middle and high schools, and juvenile probation programs. Welcome.
Thank you.
And next to her is Merle Kushner. She's a licensed social worker at Lahey Clinic. And Merle is a graduate of Brandeis University and received a master's degree from Simmons College for social worker. Her membership and clinical interests include personal relationship safety, members of Community Benefit Initiative, member of Conference of Boston Teaching Hospital Council on Domestic Violence, and coordinator of Domestic Violence Initiative, as well as other medical things at Lahey Clinic. So let's start off first. Let's talk about what are the trends we're seeing regarding who is impacted and the types of the severity of the violence. You want to answer that? You wanted me to ask you that question.
Oh, in terms of who is impacted, all people can be impacted by violence in personal relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It crosses all ages, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, sexual identity and orientation, and the types of violence, whether it's physical, emotional, it could be sexual abuse or interfering with reproductive health care. It could be financial exploitation. It could be abuse based on identity, so threatening to out someone in terms of their sexuality or out someone to immigration, or even addressing someone in a threatening, demeaning manner using words that speak to their race or disability, and the violence affects us all, whether it's something someone's witnessed or experienced in the past, in our own community or things that we hear about on the news in other communities. I think it's having a greater impact on more and more people in terms of, if not just direct, but also secondary trauma.
Right. So what are some of the laws established to protect the victims?
Well, Massachusetts was one of the very first states to enact what we refer to as the Chapter 209A, which allows for restraining orders. And that's been in effect now since 1979. So we have a well-established tradition of that. That's been enlarged at various points to include other things to recognize as technology has changed. We've also, over the years, provided a number of different kinds of crimes, for instance, strangulation, that being a crime that we most often see in intimate partner violence. We've also amended statutes to include aggravating factors, for instance, when someone is pregnant and they're assaulted, or when there's already a restraining order in place. So there's that double impact of you've already been told by the court to stay away from that person. Now you not only violated that order, but you assaulted them again. So that's looked at as an aggravating factor.
Yeah, that's very good. So what about across the country? It is wide range across the country, the same as here?
Yes, yes.
And if somebody has a restraining order in another state, and they're the plaintiff is here in Massachusetts and the order is violated, that order is good here as well.
That's
so
good.
we can go ahead and criminally charge that defendant.
And if somebody has to flee their home because of violence, so I live in New Hampshire, I have to flee my home in New Hampshire and come to my parents', I am then allowed to seek that restraining order here where I now am. So I don't have to go back to where I might be subject to abuse. I can get a restraining order here because I had to flee because of that violence.
Excellent.
When I think about changes in the law, I not only think about the criminal justice response, but also changes in laws and policies that can make services more responsive. For example, under healthcare reform, there are provisions now for preventive screening for domestic violence and family violence of adolescents and women. There have been changes in the laws in Massachusetts requiring certain components of training and ongoing education for various professionals, psychologists, physicians, social workers, and others in the area of domestic violence and risk assessment. And there are changes going on to help make housing in emergency situations more accessible, as well as financing, I believe, sexual assault exam kits that are done, and having some recourse for someone who's been assaulted to have coverage for those charges paid by a victim assistance fund. So again, the laws are, there's a social policy response that can help, again, make services more responsive.
And restraining orders are wonderful in a lot of ways. And again, Massachusetts has a long history and established, rapport with having restraining orders in this particular state. That said, I think there always also needs to be community response. One, because restraining orders don't apply or don't work for everyone. So restraining orders and a lot of the laws around domestic violence, not just here, but across the country, really focus on what's criminalized. And what's currently criminalized is really around physical harm or the threat of physical harm. And so if someone is being emotionally abused, which we talked about a lot in your last show is very common, there may not be as many legal avenues for them, even if there are. So even if someone does get a restraining order, when I used to work in the restraining order clinic, we would always talk with folks that that's not the end of your safety plan, that's a part of your safety plan. So a restraining order is not a shield that now you have it, this person can't get close to you. And so really trying to think with somebody, is a restraining order a good option? Is it a safe option? And if so, who do you feel comfortable talking to about the fact that you have a restraining order? Because it's a piece of paper. So if you feel comfortable telling your colleagues at work or telling the people in your building or telling people at your child's school, so if that person shows up in those places, they can call the police. Because otherwise, if no one else knows, the only person who knows it's being violated is you. And so you're the one who then has to call and reach out for help. And that could be a really scary, difficult situation. So even though the legal system, I think, has done a lot and has definitely just in the past few years, there's been so many new laws in Massachusetts that have been passed. There also is always going to be a need for community response.
So how is the law working with the communities today?
I think that these are cases where we have certainly seen over the last decade or so the value of these partnerships. So for instance, everyone on this panel works together on real cases. That's how we come to know each other, because we have seen that none of us can do this alone. The police just coming in and doing something doesn't address the other issues. It doesn't address the healthcare issues. So we have a lot of, for instance, across Middlesex County, a lot of high-risk task forces where everyone is represented. We have our risk task force, which addresses getting the faith community to help us with the refugee and immigrant communities, particularly because that is where they would often seek advice. We have partnered with English as a second language tutors to educate them, because very often someone who's new to this country, that's their first contact. We also look at this in terms of children and the safety of children, not just the physical safety of children who may be in a setting where there's domestic violence, but what's the impact on them? We certainly know that the trauma of witnessing that kind of violence can impede that child developing to their full potential. So we work with the schools, we work with community groups, with the hospitals in terms of addressing all of that. We are all enriched by that kind of dialogue that has brought us all literally to the table to work on these cases in a way very different than the way we addressed them 25 years ago.
So we have a program at REACH that we're really proud of called Latinas Know Your Rights, which is a partnership between Greater Boston Legal Services and our advocates. And it's really aimed at, again, addressing the additional barriers that immigrant survivors may be facing. So if I'm new to this country and I don't speak the language, where am I getting information about what my rights are? And if my abuser is the person who brought me here and I'm very isolated and I don't know anyone yet, they may be giving me some really false information about what legal rights I have. So it's really a grassroots kind of project and sort of motion forward in terms of thinking about how we can utilize partnerships to then empower the community. And so the goal of Latinas Know Your Rights is training community members to know what rights are available, what the different resources are, so they then become ambassadors and bring that information to their community, to their neighbors, to their family and their friends, because we all can't reach everyone, but if we can touch a few people who then can touch a few more, we have a greater impact. The other aspect that the district attorney was mentioning is really looking at sort of the worst case scenarios. So the situations we always want to be thinking about is how do we prevent more tragedies from occurring? And so there's been tremendous research in recognizing signs for what we consider to be high risk cases, so cases that are high risk for fatality. And so that research is really helpful in terms of how we all, as partners, are using similar assessment tools based on that research to know what to look for and what to ask, to be able to, in collaboration with the survivor, successfully and more adequately be able to assess for risk of lethality. But if we're doing that in isolation, we may not be getting the full picture, we may not necessarily be able to support them as much. So these high-risk teams that we're all a part of are a crucial part of the process and really an incredible part of our progress here in Massachusetts. Really being able to sit down together and be able to share that information so that, if the police know something that we don't, or we know something that probation officer doesn't know, really being able to have that open dialogue, we learn from one another, and ultimately the goal, of course, is that we're saving lives in the process.
Absolutely.
It's also about just leveling the playing field in many cases. For instance, we have a program where very often what we would see happen is a survivor would get a restraining order. And because that's a civil proceeding, we have advocates, community advocates that can help and go in there. But when it came time for the hearing on that restraining order, often the abuser would appear with counsel. So he would have a lawyer who would be asking her questions. It would intimidate her, make her feel that she wasn't able to present her case well enough. Maybe she didn't have the resources, whether they be financial or educational, in terms of assessing how to help herself or where to get help to get their own attorney. So we have developed a partnership with a number of law firms across the city of Boston who will provide attorneys at no cost to people who qualify for that, and they will represent survivors at that hearing. So now she goes in to face, and obviously it can be either sex, but that survivor goes in to face their abuser and his or her lawyer armed with their own lawyer, much better outcomes, much more willing to participate in the process because they are just being pushed into something unfamiliar,
Right.
unarmed, really.
Exactly.
And part of, I'm sorry.
No, and we've used that quite a few times here in Burlington. We've referred survivors to this program to seek that assistance of counsel during a restraining order hearing, and it's invaluable.
And you mentioned during the last show that people may be reluctant to go to the police. So a part of our educational effort focuses on, if I find myself in that situation and I'm not going to go to the police station, who might I tell? For instance, we brought to Middlesex County a program called Cut It Out, which was a real grassroots program that really is based on the idea that very often individuals, particularly women, will tell their hairdresser things that they won't tell anyone else, or a hairdresser may notice bruises or missing hair, things like that. So we spend a lot of our time out in the communities educating salon professionals about what kind of signs they might see, how they might respond if someone makes a disclosure to them, what resources are there. So if they're talking to someone and the person says, I'd leave, but I have no idea where I'd ever go. Well, they're now armed with that. Well, there is a shelter in our community, or there's a detective at the police department who specializes in this sort of thing.
Yeah, it's an incredible program. I think the other thing with leveling the playing field that I think is so powerful is that, last show we talked a little bit about why doesn't she just leave, or why don't they just leave the relationship, and the responsibility that's placed on the shoulders of the survivor. But even if we take that question away, very often in order to successfully leave and stay safe, the person who's changing their whole life is the survivor. They may have to move away, they may have to change jobs, they may lose contact with certain supports because those supports might tell the abuser where they are. So they're sacrificing so much while the abuser is living their life as they were before. So I think the high-risk teams and a lot of these collaborations are really aimed at how do we hold perpetrators more accountable and therefore ensure that more survivors have more freedom to be able to continue to live their lives the way they want to.
Do you have particular problems working with different cultures?
Yes,
Yes.
I do, in particular, because if somebody comes from a different culture to the United States, maybe where they're coming from, the police are not so nice, and they're going to have a hard time confiding in the police because of their personal experiences in their country. And for us, we have developed a rapport with Lahey to help us, and they've come in and they've done trainings at our station to help us work with the South Asian culture, understand it, and to be able to, reach out to them on their terms.
We've worked very hard across our office to really develop a cultural competency because of the size of Middlesex County and the number of immigrant and refugee communities that we have. So, for instance, all of our new DAs get a handbook, just giving them a little bit of information about a lot of different cultures. We have trainings for them with people coming from other cultures. We also do a lot of work around developing, both in our office and in our police departments, individuals whose native language is not English. So that, there's a lot, especially if you're having to disclose something that's very personal and very embarrassing and all of that, the really getting the translation right matters. So we distribute that. So if a Burlington police detective has someone come in who speaks a particular language and they don't have someone, they can look through the other police departments in the county and find they have an officer who speaks whatever it is and access that person so the person's more comfortable in terms of talking about that. And there's not just the fact that the folks who are being victimized may not be familiar with what their rights are or may not be anxious to get involved with the police. There may be lots of cultural taboos about leaving a relationship or going and reporting somebody in your family. It may be perfectly acceptable to behave the way that they've been behaving in their own country. And then there's obviously the whole immigration issue. So it's a very complicated, very layered issue for members of those communities.
And I think it's a balance of really being culturally sensitive and recognizing that, there are going to be different factors and different barriers, and also being culturally humble and having that humility that, I could be talking to someone who lived their whole life in the United States and they also have those very negative messages that it's not okay to divorce and all of these different things. And so, I've worked with folks, especially having worked around the country with so many different backgrounds, with each survivor, I want to be aware of what I don't know and really be, again, listening to the wisdom of that survivor's experience, not making assumptions that because they're from a particular culture, this must be how they feel about it. But I think we'd be remiss to not recognize that we need to have an even more concentrated effort to reach out to communities who aren't necessarily going to think to reach out to us. So that means really, again, partnering together to think about, okay, so we've never had a survivor from this community, but there's a huge community of these folks. Where's the disconnect? Who do we know that we can then partner with so that it's coming in a way that feels connected rather than just these outsiders coming in? And really, this is an issue, as you mentioned before, that affects everyone. So we really want to make sure that if people aren't coming forward, it's not because they don't know who we are or where we are, but they're making that decision for themselves, because it's not always going to be the right decision for them to come to us, and we want to also recognize that. But if they can confide in a friend or a family member who they trust, or a clergy member who they feel comfortable with, and that person is armed, just like the hair salon folks that you were mentioning before, that's going to help that person in the long run.
Absolutely. How do some of these laws impact the abuser now? Is it worse for them, or?
I think that in general, the shift has been from where it was probably 25 years ago, where this was really regarded as kind of a private matter. And the goal was, the response many times then, certainly from police departments, was let's just separate everybody, get through the night, and work it out. I think that police departments have come a very long way in terms of understanding their responsibility. There is, a mandatory arrest policy in Massachusetts, and I think police departments have really, in the scope of the world, a pretty short period of time, really changed the way that they respond, and have really become much more sensitive to a number of those issues.
And one of the laws that recently changed is that if we arrest a perpetrator involved in a domestic violence incident and the court is closed, they cannot get bailed out until they're with us for 6 hours. So they have to stay at the station for 6 hours before we can call the bail commissioner to see if they're eligible to receive bail. Certain times, if it's a violation of restraining order, there's no bail. If it's a straight arrest because of a domestic violence incident, then they're going to be at the station for 6 hours before we call the bail commissioner. And that is to, to give the complaining witness time to maybe connect with family members, or to get their stuff together and do what they choose, whether they want to leave or seek a restraining order, because we certainly would handle that. When the court is closed, we call the on-call judge, so that person can figure out what's going to be best for them.
Right. Yes, it'd be dangerous if they were to go home and the abuser shows up. What alternative would they have then? Then the person's more angry.
Right.
Right?
Correct.
Exactly. Well, so how do you work with the medical field in what respect? Does the law work with the medical field?
Very often, obviously, if somebody has sustained injuries and sought medical treatment, we'll be talking to the treating doctors or nurses, because that will be part of our case in terms of showing, very often that's an aggravating factor. Somebody may be charged with assault and battery with a dangerous weapon because they beat them with an object, or they stabbed them, or they shot them. And we're going to be looking for medical records to do all of that. If there were sexual assaults, we certainly are suggesting to people that for their own health, they go to the hospital and get treatment. So there's a lot of collaboration, especially in the early parts of the case.
And people who are involved in the treatment of individuals, medical treatment, are mandated reporters for abuse and neglect of elders. And when we use the term elders, it's someone 60 or over, disabled individuals between the ages of 18 and 59, and that could be a physical and or mental disability, and also mandated to report abuse of children, abuse and neglect, and that would be someone who's under the age of 18. So the law comes into play then, and when you talk about people having control, our practice is involving someone as much as possible in a mandated report in terms of letting them know what to expect if a report is made, and even involving if someone wants to be on the phone and calling and talking about what's happening, rather than again having someone feel like something's out of their control and being done to them.
Are you hearing things from survivors as to regarding what improvements they think? I mean, I'm sure they all have some kind of comments as to how they feel about the way they've been treated or handled, or the results of what happened. Do they talk to you about that at the hospital?
Well, one gap that whether you're talking to a survivor or I think anyone here is having good mental health care where people are sensitive again to current and long-range concerns, options for housing, career development, help with legal costs. If there's been some legislation in terms of people being able to have leave time from work, and there needs to be a long-range kind of perspective.
I think the response really varies. At REACH we work with 27 cities and towns, so we work with a lot of different police departments, and that individual survivor's experience also varies. I think the work that's happening now, because of some of these new laws around training, is really important because there's so much to this. There's so much nuance. There's so much complication. We sort of have an image in our mind of what a survivor of domestic violence will look like, that they'll be grateful for support and help, and that they'll clearly be in need. And a lot of times when we show up in a moment of crisis, someone is not very nice and maybe aggressive and really having these trauma responses. And so it's so important for us to constantly, for all of us, to be able to have conversations, to be able to debrief, to be able to be in spaces like high-risk teams, to learn from one another, so that ultimately survivors are getting the best support they can from anybody that they connect with. I think clearly there's an amazing safety net in Massachusetts of organizations and various systems that people might come into contact with, and sometimes they'll only come into contact with one of us, but the fact that we're all aware really helps, so that if someone is coming to the police because I think I need help, I need to go to the police, but the police aren't able to assist them with housing or other issues, then they know they can call us, and it's not a cold call, it's a warm handoff to a community resource that they're aware of.
I think that the two pieces that people forget about is, as Jessica mentioned, is number one, very, very often the situation of domestic violence that brings in some intervention from outside is one of many, many things that may be going on. So this person may be a victim of domestic violence, but they may also have homelessness issues, or they have some addiction issues, or they have some health issues, or some mental health. They've got lots of things going on. So this critical piece that we would be focusing on is just one of all of the balls that they're trying to balance at once. And at the other end of the spectrum is, we can come in, all of us, and help with the crisis. We can help them get through a prosecution if that's the route it's going, all of that. But at the end of that, even when we're done and there's been a perfect result, people then have to have a life. They have to find a way to, where do they go back to live? Where do they go to work? How do they manage if they have young children and the abuser is the other parent? There's going to be probably some contact at some point. How do they manage that? And it's really, we try to focus not just on what's before us in this incident, but helping to provide the skills for somebody going forward to rebuild their lives.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to have you all come back this month to join us on this subject.
Thank you.
I'd like to personally thank District Attorney Marian Ryan and Anne Marie Brown, detective at Burlington Police Department, and Jessica Teperow, Director of Education and Prevention at REACH, and we are putting out your number to contact. And also Merle Kushner from Lahey Hospital and Medical Clinic. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm hoping this will go out and a lot of people get educated and be able to help themselves out of some of these horrible situations. So thank you very much. So this is Be Prepared, and thank you for joining us. As always, we are performing different subjects that hopefully will help you deal with any health situations or violence or prevention. anything that we feel that could help you live a better life. And so please join us next month to see this program in October and in November. And I will see you again in December. Thank you for joining us.